The Montana Wildlife Rescue Center hummed with its usual afternoon activity when something extraordinary happened that would change everything. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the center's lead veterinarian, was conducting her routine rounds when she noticed a commotion near the large enclosure that housed their most challenging resident. Shadow, an 8-year-old black bear with a reputation for aggressive behavior, had suddenly transformed before everyone's eyes. For months, Shadow had been the center's most troubled case. His massive frame, scarred from years of unknown trauma, had struck fear into even the most experienced handlers. The bear's dark eyes held a fury that seemed to burn from within, and his powerful swipes at the reinforced glass had left countless scratches as testimony to his rage. Staff members had learned to approach his enclosure with extreme caution, never making direct eye contact, never lingering too long. Shadow's aggression was legendary among the rescue community, and many had quietly wondered if rehabilitation was even possible for such a damaged animal. But on this particular afternoon, as autumn light filtered through the center's windows, something miraculous occurred. Shadow had been pacing restlessly in his enclosure when he suddenly stopped, his massive head turning toward the observation area through the reinforced glass. He spotted a figure that made his entire demeanor shift in an instant. The bear's aggressive posture melted away, replaced by something that left the watching staff speechless. Robert Bob Matthews stood outside the fence, his weathered hands gripping the metal links as he stared in disbelief at the creature before him. At 60 years old, Bob carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent decades in the wilderness, his silver hair and lined face telling stories of countless seasons in Yellowstone National Park. His ranger uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, but his eyes still held that sharp awareness that came from years of reading the subtle language of wild animals. Shadow's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The bear that had terrorized handlers for months suddenly stood upright on his hind legs, his massive frame reaching nearly 7 feet in height, his front paws pressed gently against the reinforced glass, not in aggression, but in what could only be described as desperate recognition. The sounds that emerged from his throat were unlike anything the staff had ever heard from him, gentle moans that seemed to carry years of longing and pain. Dr. Walsh found herself frozen in amazement as she watched Shadow begin to perform behaviors that had never been documented in his file. The bear's massive paws came together in a gentle clapping motion, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of several observers, Shadow raised one paw and began to wave at Bob, his movements deliberate and filled with an almost human-like recognition. The silence in the observation area was profound as staff members tried to process what they were witnessing. This was the same bear who had charged at the glass whenever anyone approached, the same animal who had been deemed too dangerous for standard rehabilitation protocols. Yet here he was displaying behaviors that suggested not just intelligence, but a deep emotional connection to the man standing outside. Bob's own reaction was equally moving. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he pressed his palm against the fence, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Shadow, my boy, I never stopped looking for you." The pain in his voice spoke of years of searching, of sleepless nights and endless worry, of a bond that had transcended the typical relationship between human and wild animal. The story of how this extraordinary connection began reached back nearly 8 years to a time when Yellowstone National Park was engulfed in one of the most devastating forest fires in its history. Bob had been a seasoned ranger then, with over 30 years of experience in wildlife management and forest protection. He had seen countless fires, rescued numerous animals, and thought he had witnessed every possible scenario that nature could present. But nothing had prepared him for the discovery he made during the evacuation of a remote section of the park. The fire had been raging for 3 days when Bob and his team were conducting a final sweep of the area, ensuring that no animals remained trapped in the path of destruction. The smoke was so thick that visibility was reduced to mere yards, and the heat was becoming unbearable even with protective gear. It was during this dangerous mission that Bob heard the faint cries that would change his life forever. Following the sound through the smoky wilderness, Bob discovered a tiny black bear cub, no more than 6 months old, trapped beneath a fallen log. The cub's mother was nowhere to be found, likely having perished in the flames or been separated during the chaos of evacuation. The little bear was weak, dehydrated, and terrified, his tiny body trembling as he struggled to free himself from the debris. Bob's training told him to call for backup, to follow protocol and let the wildlife specialist handle the situation. But something about the cub's desperate cries touched something deep within him. Without hesitation, he began the careful process of lifting the heavy log, his muscles straining against the weight while flames crept closer through the underbrush. The rescue was harrowing, with Bob having to shield the cub with his own body as burning embers fell around them. The moment Bob lifted the tiny bear to safety, something extraordinary happened. Instead of fleeing or cowering in fear, the cub seemed to understand that this human had saved his life. He nestled against Bob's chest, his small paws gripping the ranger's jacket as if he never wanted to let go. It was during this rescue that the cub received the Y-shaped scar on his ear, a mark left by a burning branch that would later become his most distinctive identifying feature. Bob knew that protocol demanded he turn the cub over to wildlife rehabilitation specialists, but the nearest facility was hundreds of miles away, and the cub was too weak to survive the journey. Making a decision that would later be questioned by his superiors, Bob chose to care for the cub himself at the remote ranger station where he was stationed. He named the little bear Shadow, partly because of his dark fur and partly because the cub seemed to follow him everywhere like a faithful shadow. The next 2 years at the ranger station became a period of unprecedented bonding between human and bear. Bob transformed part of his living quarters into a suitable habitat for Shadow, creating a space that was both safe and stimulating for a growing bear. He researched everything he could about bear behavior, nutrition, and development, becoming an expert in caring for his unusual charge. What made their relationship truly extraordinary was the communication system that developed between them. Bob discovered that Shadow was remarkably intelligent, capable of learning and responding to various signals and commands. The bear learned to nod when he was happy or content, a behavior that never failed to amaze visitors to the station. When Shadow wanted to play, he would clap his paws together gently, creating a sound that Bob came to recognize as an invitation for interaction. But perhaps the most remarkable behavior was Shadow's morning greeting ritual. Every day as Bob emerged from his quarters to begin his ranger duties, Shadow would wave at him with one massive paw, a gesture that seemed to say, "Good morning, my friend." This behavior was so unusual that it attracted the attention of wildlife behaviorists from across the country, many of whom made special trips to observe this unprecedented human-bear relationship. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a renowned animal behaviorist from the University of Montana, spent several weeks at the station studying Shadow's behaviors. Her research documented over 40 distinct gestures and vocalizations that Shadow used specifically when communicating with Bob, suggesting a level of interspecies communication that challenged existing scientific understanding. Her published papers on the subject became required reading in wildlife behavior courses across the nation. The bond between Bob and Shadow extended beyond mere communication. The bear showed genuine affection for his human companion, often seeking out physical contact and comfort. When Bob was injured during a hiking accident, Shadow refused to leave his side, lying next to the ranger's bed for 3 days until he recovered. When Bob was sad or stressed, Shadow seemed to sense his emotions, offering comfort in the form of gentle nuzzles and soft vocalizations. As Shadow grew larger and stronger, Bob knew that the day would come when he would have to make the difficult decision to release him back into the wild. Despite the extraordinary bond they shared, Bob understood that Shadow was still a wild animal who deserved to live freely in his natural habitat. The decision was one of the most difficult of Bob's life, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The release took place on a crisp autumn morning in a remote section of Yellowstone far from human activity. Bob had prepared for this moment for months, gradually reducing his interactions with Shadow and encouraging the bear to spend more time exploring the wilderness around the station. When the day finally arrived, Bob led Shadow to the release site, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be their final goodbye. But Shadow had other plans. Within a week of his release, the bear had found his way back to the ranger station, appearing at Bob's door as if he had simply been on a brief vacation. This pattern continued for months, with Shadow disappearing into the wilderness for days or weeks at a time, only to return to visit his human friend. The bear had learned to live independently in the wild while maintaining his special relationship with Bob. These visits became the highlight of Bob's existence. Shadow would arrive at the station, perform his familiar greeting gestures, and spend time with Bob before returning to his wild life. The bear was thriving in his natural environment, but he had chosen to maintain the bond that had saved his life years earlier. Wildlife officials were initially concerned about this unusual arrangement, but Shadow's behavior posed no threat to humans or other wildlife, and his visits were confined to the remote ranger station. The scientific community was fascinated by this ongoing relationship. Researchers from around the world came to study Shadow and his interactions with Bob, documenting behaviors that challenged traditional understanding of human-wildlife relationships. The bear's ability to navigate between wild and domestic behaviors, his apparent emotional attachment to a human, and his sophisticated communication skills made him a subject of international interest. For 3 years, this extraordinary arrangement continued. Shadow would disappear into the wilderness for extended periods, living as a wild bear should, hunting, foraging, and avoiding human contact, but he would always return to Bob. Their reunions were marked by the same joyful gestures and vocalizations that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Then, without warning, everything changed. Shadow's visits became less frequent, and when he did appear, he seemed agitated and fearful. Bob noticed that the bear had lost weight and appeared to be suffering from stress. The final visit was heartbreaking. Shadow appeared at the station in the middle of the night, his usual greeting gestures replaced by nervous pacing and anxious vocalizations. He stayed only a few hours before disappearing into the darkness, and Bob never saw him again. The disappearance of Shadow coincided with reports of increased wildlife trafficking activity in the Yellowstone region. A sophisticated criminal organization had been operating in the area, capturing exotic animals for sale to private collectors, illegal fighting rings, and black market dealers. Bob's worst fears were confirmed when he learned that several other bears had gone missing during the same period, all of them vanishing without a trace. Bob's transformation from ranger to searcher began immediately. Despite his colleagues' attempts to convince him that Shadow was likely living peacefully somewhere in the vast wilderness, Bob's instincts told him otherwise. The bear's final visit, his obvious distress, and the timing of his disappearance all pointed to something sinister. At 60 years old, Bob made the decision to dedicate his life to finding Shadow, regardless of the cost. The search began with Bob using his ranger connections to gather information about wildlife trafficking in the region. He learned that the criminal organization was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized, with operations spanning multiple states and connections to international wildlife smuggling networks. The group specialized in capturing animals with unique characteristics or behaviors, making Shadow, with his extraordinary human-bear bond, an ideal target. Bob's first lead came from an unexpected source. An amateur photographer in Colorado had captured a blurry image of a bear being transported in a cage on the back of a truck. The photograph was poor quality, but Bob's trained eye immediately noticed a distinctive Y-shaped scar on the bear's ear. His heart raced as he recognized Shadow's unique marking, the scar that had been left by the burning branch during their first meeting years earlier. The Colorado lead sent Bob on a treacherous journey through the Rocky Mountains, following rumors and whispered reports from truckers, hunters, and local residents. The physical demands of the search were enormous for a man his age. Bob found himself climbing dangerous mountain passes in harsh weather, his body pushed to its limits as he pursued every potential clue. During one particularly harrowing search, he became lost in a Colorado forest for 3 days, surviving on minimal supplies while temperatures dropped below freezing. The financial burden of the search quickly became overwhelming. Bob had retired from the ranger service with a modest pension, but the cost of travel, equipment, and investigation quickly depleted his savings. After 8 months of searching, he was forced to sell his home and most of his possessions to continue funding his quest. Friends and family begged him to give up, to accept that Shadow was gone and try to rebuild his life. But Bob's determination never wavered. The second major clue came from Dr. Patricia Williams, a veterinarian in Idaho who had been contacted by Bob during his search. She reported treating a severely injured bear at what appeared to be an illegal camp in the wilderness. The bear's injuries were consistent with forced fighting, and his behavior suggested deep psychological trauma. Most telling was the bear's reaction to human presence. Instead of the typical fear or aggression, the animal displayed a heartbreaking combination of hope and terror, as if he was simultaneously longing for and dreading human contact. Dr. Williams' description of the bear's condition filled Bob with both hope and horror. The injuries she described, claw marks, bite wounds, and signs of prolonged stress, painted a picture of an animal being forced to fight for the entertainment of others. The thought of Shadow, who had once greeted him with gentle waves and playful claps, being subjected to such cruelty was almost more than Bob could bear. The pursuit of this lead took Bob deep into Idaho's wilderness, where he encountered the criminal organization directly for the first time. The confrontation was terrifying. Masked men appeared at his campsite in the middle of the night, threatening him with violence if he continued his search. They burned his tent and equipment, leaving him stranded in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back. The message was clear: stop searching or face the consequences. But Bob's determination had been forged in the same fires that had originally brought him and Shadow together. The threats only strengthened his resolve, and he continued his search with even greater urgency. The stress of the situation, combined with the physical demands of his quest, took a severe toll on his health. During a particularly difficult climb in the Idaho mountains, Bob suffered a mild heart attack, collapsing on a remote trail with no one around to help. Bob's rescue came from an unexpected source, a young Native American man named Tommy Crow Feather, who was hunting in the area and found Bob unconscious on the trail. Tommy, a member of the Blackfeet Nation, had heard about Bob's search through social media and had been following his progress with interest. Without hesitation, Tommy carried Bob to safety and stayed with him during his recovery. The meeting with Tommy proved to be a turning point in Bob's search. The young man, who worked as a wilderness guide and had extensive knowledge of the region's hidden locations, volunteered to join Bob's quest. Tommy's skills as a tracker and his connections within the Native American community provided Bob with resources and information that had previously been unavailable to him. The third and final clue came from an unlikely source, a long-haul truck driver named Jake Morrison who had been hired to transport special cargo from Idaho to Nevada. Jake had been haunted by the sounds he heard during that journey, particularly the sorrowful growls of what he believed to be a bear. The sounds were unlike anything he had ever heard from a wild animal. They were filled with a grief and longing that seemed almost human in their emotional depth. Jake's description of the route and timing matched perfectly with Bob's investigation, and his detailed account of the transport operation provided crucial information about the criminal organization's methods. The truck driver's conscience had been troubled by his unknowing participation in the illegal transport, and he was eager to help Bob in any way possible. Meanwhile, Bob's story had begun to spread through social media, capturing the attention of animal lovers around the world. The tale of a retired ranger searching for his beloved bear companion resonated with people from all walks of life, and support began pouring in from unexpected sources. Dr. Maria Santos, a Mexican-American veterinarian from California, was so moved by Bob's story that she took a leave of absence from her practice to join the search effort. Dr. Santos brought not only her medical expertise, but also her connections within the veterinary community, providing Bob with a network of professionals who could help identify and treat trafficked animals. Her fluency in Spanish also proved invaluable when following leads that crossed into Mexico, where the criminal organization had connections to international smuggling networks. The support from the online community was overwhelming. Thousands of people from around the world sent donations, equipment, and supplies to support Bob's search. A volunteer rescue team of 15 people from 8 different states organized to assist in the Nevada operation, bringing specialized equipment and expertise that Bob could never have afforded on his own. Tommy Crow Feather's role in the search extended beyond his skills as a tracker. His understanding of traditional Native American beliefs about the spiritual connection between humans and animals provided Bob with a different perspective on his relationship with Shadow. Tommy shared stories from his tribal traditions about the sacred bonds that could form between humans and wild creatures, helping Bob understand that his connection to Shadow was part of something much larger than himself. The final phase of the search led to Nevada, where the criminal organization operated an illegal animal fighting camp in a remote desert location. The facility was a horrific place where exotic animals were forced to fight for the entertainment of wealthy spectators who paid enormous sums to watch the brutal spectacles. The operation was run by Vincent Kane, a ruthless criminal who had built his empire on the suffering of innocent animals. Bob's approach to the Nevada facility required careful planning and coordination with federal authorities. The FBI had been investigating the wildlife trafficking organization for years, but they had been unable to locate the main facility or gather sufficient evidence to make arrests. Bob's information provided the breakthrough they needed, but the rescue operation would be extremely dangerous. The raid on the facility was planned for dawn, when the criminals would be least prepared for an assault. Bob insisted on being part of the operation despite the dangers involved. His knowledge of Shadow's behavior and his ability to communicate with the bear could be crucial to the rescue's success. The FBI agents were initially reluctant to allow a civilian to participate in such a dangerous operation, but Bob's expertise and determination eventually convinced them. The scene that greeted the rescue team at the facility was heartbreaking. Dozens of animals were confined in small, filthy cages, their conditions deplorable, and their spirits broken by months or years of abuse. The fighting arena was stained with blood, and the smell of fear and suffering permeated the entire compound. Bob's heart raced as he searched among the cages for any sign of Shadow. When Bob finally found Shadow, the sight nearly broke his heart. The magnificent bear, who had once greeted him with joyful waves and gentle claps, was now a shadow of his former self. Shadow's once glossy black fur was matted and scarred, his powerful frame reduced by malnutrition and stress. Most heartbreaking of all were his eyes. The bright, intelligent gaze that had once sparkled with life and recognition was now dull and empty, filled with a fear so profound that it seemed to have extinguished his very soul. Shadow's reaction to Bob's presence was devastating. The bear who had once run to greet his human friend now cowered in the corner of his cage, his body trembling with terror. The months of torture and abuse had broken not just his body, but his spirit, leaving him unable to trust even the person who had once been his closest companion. Bob's attempts to approach the cage only seemed to increase Shadow's distress, and it became clear that the bear no longer recognized him. The rescue team worked quickly to secure the facility and arrest the criminals, but Bob's attention was focused entirely on Shadow. Sitting outside the bear's cage, Bob began to sing softly, his voice carrying the melody of Amazing Grace, the same hymn he had sung to comfort Shadow during those first frightening nights at the ranger station years earlier. The song had been their special ritual, a way for Bob to soothe the young cub's fears and help him feel safe in his new environment. The effect of the familiar melody was gradual but unmistakable. Shadow's trembling began to subside, and his head slowly lifted from where it had been buried in his paws. His ears twitched as he recognized the sound that had once brought him such comfort, and his dull eyes began to show the first spark of recognition. As Bob continued to sing, Shadow's posture gradually changed from one of cowering fear to cautious hope. The moment of recognition was profound and heartbreaking. Shadow's eyes suddenly focused on Bob's face, and the bear let out a sound that was part whimper, part moan, and entirely filled with years of pain and longing. Slowly, carefully, Shadow approached the front of his cage, his massive paw reaching through the bars toward the man who had never stopped searching for him. When their hands finally touched, both man and bear broke down completely. Shadow's powerful frame shook with what could only be described as emotion, while Bob wept openly at the sight of his beloved companion's suffering. The entire rescue team, including hardened FBI agents who had seen countless horrors in their careers, found themselves moved to tears by the emotional reunion. The process of rehabilitating Shadow was long and difficult. Dr. Maria Santos took charge of treating his physical injuries, which were extensive and required months of careful medical attention. The bear's psychological trauma was even more challenging to address, requiring patience, understanding, and an enormous amount of love from everyone involved in his care. Shadow's journey back to health was marked by small victories and heartbreaking setbacks. It took 6 months before he would eat normally again, his trust in humans so shattered that he feared even the most basic care. Bob spent countless hours sitting with Shadow, talking to him, singing to him, and slowly rebuilding the bond that had been so cruelly broken. The breakthrough came almost a year after the rescue when Shadow finally performed his old greeting gesture, a gentle wave of his paw that brought tears of joy to Bob's eyes. It was a sign that the bear's spirit was healing, that the connection between them was still alive despite everything he had endured. From that moment forward, Shadow's recovery accelerated, and glimpses of his old personality began to emerge. Tommy Crowfeather played a crucial role in Shadow's rehabilitation, sharing traditional Native American healing practices and stories that seemed to resonate with the bear's wounded spirit. Tommy's gentle presence and understanding of the spiritual aspects of human-animal relationships provided a different kind of healing that complemented the medical treatment Shadow was receiving. The decision to establish Haven Valley came naturally as Shadow's recovery progressed. Bob realized that returning Shadow to the wild was no longer an option. The bear's trauma had left him unable to survive independently, and his special needs required ongoing care and attention. Rather than confining Shadow to a traditional zoo or sanctuary, Bob decided to create a place where he could live freely while receiving the care he needed. Haven Valley was established on a beautiful piece of land in Montana, far from the crowds and noise of civilization. The sanctuary was designed to provide a natural environment where Shadow could live comfortably while accommodating his unique needs and behaviors. The facility also became a haven for other animals rescued from trafficking operations, providing them with a safe place to heal and live out their lives in peace. Dr. Maria Santos's role in Shadow's recovery had brought her and Bob closer together, and their shared dedication to helping traumatized animals had blossomed into a deep personal relationship. Their wedding was a simple ceremony held at Haven Valley with Shadow serving as an honorary best man, a role that brought laughter and tears to all who witnessed it. The sight of the massive bear standing peacefully beside the couple as they exchanged vows was a powerful symbol of the healing power of love and dedication. Tommy Crowfeather became the operations director of Haven Valley, bringing his unique perspective and skills to the management of the sanctuary. His understanding of traditional ecological knowledge and his ability to communicate with both animals and people made him an invaluable part of the team. Under his guidance, Haven Valley became not just a sanctuary, but a place where visitors could learn about the importance of respecting and protecting wild animals. The introduction of Luna, a female bear rescued from an illegal circus, marked another important milestone in Shadow's recovery. The two bears were initially wary of each other, their past traumas making it difficult for them to trust even their own kind. But with Bob's patient guidance and the supportive environment of Haven Valley, they gradually began to form a bond that would prove to be deeply healing for both of them. The birth of Hope and Freedom, Shadow and Luna's cubs, brought an explosion of joy to Haven Valley. Bob, now 65 years old, found himself in the unexpected role of grandfather to the two playful cubs. Watching Shadow interact with his offspring was deeply moving. The bear, who had once been so broken by human cruelty, was now teaching his own children the special signals and gestures that Bob had taught him years earlier. The cub's presence seemed to complete Shadow's healing process. The responsibility of being a father combined with the joy of watching his offspring grow and play brought back the spark of life that had been missing from his eyes for so long. Bob spent hours teaching Hope and Freedom the same communication signals he had taught their father, creating a new generation of bears who understood the special bond that could exist between humans and animals. The success of Haven Valley inspired the creation of the Shadow Foundation, a national charity dedicated to rescuing animals from trafficking operations and providing them with safe, loving homes. The foundation's work expanded rapidly, with supporters from around the world contributing to its mission. Within 5 years, the organization had rescued over 300 animals, established 12 smaller sanctuaries across the United States, and trained over 500 volunteers in animal rescue techniques. The Foundation's advocacy work also led to significant changes in wildlife protection laws, with stricter penalties for trafficking and better resources for enforcement agencies. Shadow's story had become a powerful symbol of the need to protect wild animals from exploitation, and his image appeared on posters and materials used in educational campaigns around the world. As the years passed, Bob found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. The retired ranger, who had once lived a quiet, solitary life, had become the center of a movement that touched lives around the world. The bond he had formed with a frightened bear cub in a burning forest had grown into something that transcended species, inspiring others to recognize the deep connections that could exist between humans and animals. On quiet evenings at Haven Valley, Bob would sit on his porch swing and watch his unusual family. Shadow, now older and moving more slowly, would still lumber over to join him, their old greeting rituals maintained despite the passage of time. Luna would settle nearby with their grown cubs, creating a peaceful scene that represented everything Bob had fought to protect and preserve. The conversations between Bob and Shadow had evolved over the years, becoming more subtle and nuanced as both man and bear aged. Shadow's eyes, once bright with youth and later dulled by trauma, now held a different kind of wisdom, the deep understanding that comes from having survived great suffering and found healing through love and dedication. In the golden light of a Montana sunset, Bob would stroke Shadow's graying fur and reflect on the lessons their relationship had taught him. The bear who had once been a frightened cub had become his greatest teacher, showing him the true meaning of unconditional love, the power of perseverance, and the importance of never giving up on those we care about. Shadow's response to these quiet moments was always the same, a gentle placement of his massive head on Bob's lap, his eyes gazing peacefully at the human.